It was a chilly evening and the kind of night where every detail seemed sharper than usual. The lights in the large hall reflected off polished floors and crystal glasses, casting tiny flickers that danced around the room. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and freshly polished wood. Guests in designer clothes and sparkling jewelry moved gracefully between tables, laughing softly, exchanging polite smiles and practiced conversation. Every corner of the room whispered wealth and sophistication. But in the middle of it all, in a quiet shadow by the wall, stood a young woman who looked completely out of place. She wasn't dressed in glittering silk or carrying a designer bag. Her shoes were simple, almost worn out, and her dress was plain, made from soft fabric that had seen many washes. She carried herself with humility, her shoulders slightly hunched. Not because she lacked confidence, but because she was used to blending into the background. Her eyes, however, were alive. They scanned the room quietly, taking in the elegance, the smiles, and the subtle judgments that sometimes appeared in the glances of strangers. The young woman wasn't here to impress anyone. She hadn't planned to attend the event, really. She had been walking past, drawn by the sound of music and laughter spilling out of the hall. Something about the way the piano echoed through the doors had pulled her in. She had always loved music, and tonight her feet had led her toward something she couldn't explain. She wasn't thinking about money, status, or applause. All she wanted was to be near the piano, to feel its presence, and maybe, just maybe, let her fingers touch the keys. Meanwhile, in the corner of the room, a man who carried the unmistakable aura of wealth and power noticed her. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and his posture suggested confidence, maybe even arrogance. People often deferred to him in the room. His opinions carried weight, and his laughter could fill a space without asking permission. He had seen hundreds of people tonight, all polished and prepared, all playing the roles expected in a room like this. But there was something about her that caught his attention. Maybe it was the quiet determination in her eyes, or the way she seemed so small and unnoticed in a crowd of giants. He moved closer to her without announcing it. His curiosity was piqued, though it wasn't exactly kindness that led him there. More than anything, he wanted to see what she would do if challenged. In his world, talent was something to be tested, measured, and sometimes humiliated for entertainment. And here she was, standing shyly by the wall, completely unaware of the scrutiny. "Do you play?" he asked casually, though his voice carried an edge of challenge. She looked up, startled. The question hung in the air, heavier than she expected. She nodded quietly. "A little," she said, almost too softly to hear. The millionaire smiled, not kindly, but with amusement. "A little? Well, I think we should test that," he said, gesturing toward the grand piano at the center of the room. "Why don't you play something for us?" The words seemed harmless, but in that room, with so many people watching, they carried a kind of weight. Some of the guests chuckled politely. Others whispered to each other, glancing at the young woman with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. A few shook their heads slightly, as if they couldn't imagine someone like her simple, quiet, unknown daring to step into their world. Her heart started racing. She hadn't expected to be put on the spot. Every instinct told her to say no, to step back and disappear into the crowd where she belonged. But another part of her, the part that had spent countless nights dreaming of playing, of feeling the music flow through her fingers, urged her forward. Slowly, she walked toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last, though she kept her gaze down. Avoiding the stares and whispers, the closer she got, the louder the room seemed to become. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses of wine froze halfway to lips. People turned to see what would happen. The millionaire followed her with a steady, amused gaze, confident that this would be entertaining at her expense. He thought he was about to witness a mistake, a failure, maybe even a moment that would amuse his friends. He had no idea what was coming. She reached the piano and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. They were cold under her touch, and for a moment she hesitated, taking a deep breath. She remembered all the times she had played alone, when no one was listening, when the music was just for her. She remembered the comfort it had given her, the escape it had offered from a world that often felt too harsh. And in that moment, she decided that she wouldn't let fear control her. She wouldn't let doubt win. The room was silent now, every eye on her. She could feel their expectations pressing down, their judgment almost physical. And yet, beneath that, there was a strange energy of tension that made her pulse faster. This was the moment she had been waiting for in her own quiet way. She had spent years dreaming of music, of sharing it, and now, without warning, she was here, facing a room full of people who didn't know her, and a man who thought he held all the power. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and let her fingers find the keys. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper. But as it resonated through the room, a strange hush fell over everyone. The millionaire raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Guests leaned forward, curious, trying to understand what they were hearing. The sound wasn't loud or showy, but it was precise, deliberate, and full of emotion. She didn't play to impress them. She didn't play to prove them wrong. She played because it was the only thing she could do in that moment that felt true. Each note told a story of quiet struggle, of small victories, of a love for music that had survived despite obstacles. The room seemed to hold its breath. People stopped moving, stopped talking. Even the soft clinking of glasses faded away. It was as if time itself had slowed down to listen. The millionaire, who had expected a performance that might amuse him for a moment, found himself leaning closer. He couldn't look away. Something in the music touched a part of him that rarely stirred in the presence of wealth or power. He realized, almost reluctantly, that this wasn't about status, about who owned the most or had the most influence. This was something else entirely. For the young woman, it was as though the room had vanished. All that existed was her and the piano, the music flowing from her hands, carrying with it everything she had ever felt. She could feel the energy of the room shift, though she didn't need to look. She knew, somehow, that the audience was being moved in ways that went beyond words. By the time she finished the first piece, the room was silent, not awkwardly. Not in anticipation of what might go wrong, but in awe. The millionaire's smirk had vanished, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time, respect mixed with genuine surprise. The young woman had entered a world that wasn't hers, had been challenged without warning, and had responded not with fear, but with something much more powerful, authenticity. And in that moment, she realized something important herself. It wasn't about impressing the millionaire or the wealthy crowd. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about being true to herself, about letting the music speak in a way words never could. That truth had a power far greater than she had imagined. The first part of her story ended there, with silence, with anticipation, and with the promise that this was only the beginning. One small song had already begun to change the room, and everyone, whether they knew it yet or not, was about to be changed along with it. After the first soft notes faded into silence, the room felt heavier than before. It was a silence full of expectation, curiosity, and a little disbelief. Guests who had been chatting or laughing just moments ago now stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Their polite smiles had vanished, replaced by a quiet attention they hadn't expected to feel. Some stared at her with wide eyes, others whispered softly to the person next to them, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. The young woman, standing by the piano, sensed all of it. Every glance, every whisper, every tiny shift in the room reached her like a wave. She felt exposed, yet strangely alive. The millionaire leaned against the back of a chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had expected her to fumble, to play a few wrong notes, to offer a performance that could be dismissed with a chuckle. But that hadn't happened. The music had been precise, emotional, and effortless. He felt a strange knot in his chest, an unfamiliar mix of surprise and admiration. He glanced around at the crowd, noting their reactions. Some were leaning forward, mesmerized. Others had stopped talking entirely, caught by something more powerful than wealth, status, or social polish. At that moment, the young woman closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wasn't thinking about the room or the millionaire anymore. She was thinking about the music itself, the way it made her heart beat faster, the way each note seemed to carry a fragment of her life story. Her fingers hovered over the keys, remembering late nights alone at a smaller, older piano in a room far away from elegance, where her parents had barely noticed her dreams and her friends had dismissed her ambitions. Music had been her sanctuary, the one place where she felt she truly belonged. And tonight, standing in front of a room full of strangers, she realized that same music could speak louder than words ever could. A faint murmur began to ripple through the audience, soft at first, almost invisible. Some of the guests shifted in their seats, adjusting their posture as they realized that this performance wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something rare, something that demanded attention. The young woman felt their curiosity and doubt, but she didn't let it control her. She had learned long ago that fear was a poor companion for someone who loved music. If she wanted to play truly, she had to forget the audience entirely. She began again, this time with more confidence. The notes were deliberate, flowing with a rhythm that told a story without words. It wasn't loud or showy. There were no dramatic flourishes or sudden bursts meant to grab attention. Instead, every note was a reflection of patience, care, and a quiet strength. The music seemed to stretch through the room, filling the corners, wrapping around the guests, and slowly softening the air of judgment that had lingered just moments before. Some guests felt a lump form in their throats. They didn't know why, but the music touched something deep inside. A few faces showed tears threatening to escape, quickly brushed away in polite dignity. Others clenched their fists under the table, overwhelmed by a mixture of awe and surprise. The young woman could sense it, though she wasn't looking for it. She played because it was the only way to tell her story, to share a piece of herself that words could never capture. The millionaire, who had watched so many performances in his life, found himself leaning forward, unable to look away. He felt a strange stirring in his chest, an unfamiliar tug that had nothing to do with control or entertainment. This was different. This wasn't about showing off, impressing the right people, or proving superiority. This was honesty, raw and unfiltered. He looked at the young woman's hands as they moved effortlessly over the keys, at the way her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. And something inside him shifted. He realized that all the wealth, the influence, and the power he had accumulated could not create this moment. Money could buy talent, connections, or even fame, but it could not buy authenticity. The young woman, who had come here unnoticed and almost invisible, was showing a courage that far surpassed anything he had ever commanded in his world. A waiter passing by accidentally dropped a tray of glasses, but no one noticed. The entire room seemed suspended in a bubble of sound and emotion. Even those who were initially skeptical could not deny the magic unfolding before them. The music was pulling everyone together, breaking down invisible walls of class, status, and expectation. It was extraordinary how a simple song, played with care and heart, could make people forget themselves entirely. The young woman continued to play, her confidence growing with each note. She began to experiment subtly, adding small flourishes that highlighted her understanding of the piano's voice. It was clear she had practiced tirelessly, not for an audience like this, but for herself, and that dedication shone through in every keystroke. Some guests who had been leaning back, arms crossed in doubt, now sat forward, eyes wide, mouths slightly open in astonishment. They had come expecting a polite performance at best, maybe a mild amusement at worst. Instead, they were witnessing something profound. The millionaire's mind raced. He had thought this would be a game, a challenge, maybe even a laugh at her expense. But now he could see it clearly. She wasn't here for anyone's approval. She was here for the music and the music alone. That made her unstoppable. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling a combination of admiration and unease. He had never seen anyone command attention simply by being true to themselves. As the song progressed, the young woman's movements became more fluid, almost like dancing with the keys. Her face was serene yet alive, glowing with the energy that came from doing something you were born to do. The room had completely changed its mood. What was once polite curiosity had transformed into rapt attention. People were no longer talking or whispering. They were listening, captivated by a story that wasn't spoken but sung through the piano. The young woman paused for a brief moment, allowing a single, long note to linger in the air. The effect was electric. Every guest in the room felt the vibration, subtle but undeniable. It was as if time had slowed, allowing them to experience the music in a way that reached far deeper than casual listening ever could. Some closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried away. Others sat rigid, afraid to break the spell. And the millionaire, standing at the edge of his pride and expectation, felt a quiet humility take root. She smiled faintly, not at the audience, not at the millionaire, but at the music itself. She had always believed in its power, but now she saw firsthand how it could touch people in unexpected ways. Her nerves, the hesitation, the fear, all of it melted away. She was no longer just a young woman standing in a room of strangers. She was a storyteller using her piano as her voice. And the room, for the first time that evening, had stopped being a room full of wealthy guests. It had become a living audience, breathing with her, feeling every rise and fall of the melody. Finally, the song ended. The last note lingered longer than she expected, vibrating softly in the polished hall. The room remained silent, but this silence was different from the one that had come before. It was not awkward or uncertain. It was awe, deep and sincere. The millionaire, who had challenged her moments ago, now looked at her with a respect that words could not express. The young woman had done more than play a song. She had changed the energy of the room, shifted the perspective of everyone present, and reminded them of the raw, undeniable power of authenticity, even as some guests whispered to each other. Trying to process what had just happened, the young woman remained calm. She knew that the moment was significant, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. One song had captured attention and changed perception, but the journey was far from over. She had opened a door, and now it was up to her and the music to see where it would lead. The millionaire's gaze lingered, no longer amused, no longer challenging. He realized that he had underestimated her, as he had underestimated the power of genuine talent and courage. He took a small step forward, almost unconsciously, drawn by something more than curiosity, drawn by the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to prove except to herself, and in doing so had shown everyone else a glimpse of something extraordinary. The room remained hushed, but the energy had changed completely. What had started as a simple challenge had turned into a profound experience, reminding everyone present that talent could not be measured by wealth, that courage could not be bought, and that sometimes the quietest, most unnoticed person could hold the most power of all. And in that moment, standing at the piano, the young woman felt a small, quiet triumph. She had faced doubt, challenge, and expectation and had risen above them, not by showing off but by being true. The first notes had been a test. The second part of her performance had been a revelation, and the entire room had begun to change without realizing it. One song was no longer just music. It was a statement, a challenge reversed, and a beginning of a story that everyone present would remember for a long time. The young woman took a deep breath and let her fingers hover over the keys once more. The room, still holding the memory of her first song, now seemed to lean in, waiting for what would come next. Every guest felt it, the quiet tension, the unspoken question, what will she do now? Some eyes were wide with curiosity, others softened with a kind of awe they hadn't expected to feel. The millionaire, standing nearby, folded his arms and leaned slightly forward, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. He had thought he knew what talent looked like, what a performance should be, but she was quietly proving him wrong. Note by note, she didn't rush. She had learned in her years of practice that the most powerful music came not from speed, but from intention. Each key she pressed was deliberate, each pause meaningful. She remembered the nights she had spent alone, fingers moving over the worn keys of a small, battered piano, playing pieces that no one listened to. It had always been just her and the music. And now, in this grand hall full of strangers, it was as though those quiet moments of dedication were finally finding their stage. Her song began softly, almost tentatively, but quickly grew with confidence. It carried a story of struggle and resilience, each note rising and falling with emotion that was impossible to fake. The wealthy guests, who had entered the hall expecting elegance and polite conversation, suddenly found themselves caught in something far greater than any social expectation. They weren't just hearing music, they were feeling it, deep in their bones, as if it had been waiting for them all along. The young woman could sense their attention. She didn't look up at them, didn't need to. She felt it in the air, in the way even the chatter had died down completely. Someone in the back of the room shifted in their seat. Someone else clutched the edge of a table as if grounding themselves against the unexpected intensity of the music. Even the millionaire, who had issued the challenge moments ago with a smirk, seemed affected. His eyes followed her hands as they danced across the keys. His usual confidence replaced with something closer to wonder. The first few measures were gentle, almost like a whisper, but then she allowed the melody to grow. It moved through the room like a tide, swelling and receding, pulling at emotions that many of the guests had long forgotten existed. Some felt a sudden pang of nostalgia, a memory from childhood, a moment they had cherished but never spoken about. Others felt the weight of unspoken dreams and lost opportunities, and a quiet sigh escaped lips that hadn't expected to feel such vulnerability in a room full of strangers. The young woman's body moved with the rhythm, swaying slightly, completely absorbed in the music. Her eyes closed occasionally, but not in fear or uncertainty. She closed them to listen, to feel, to become one with the piano and the story she was telling. Every chord resonated not just in the room, but in the hearts of those who had come expecting spectacle and had instead found sincerity. The wealthy guests, accustomed to power and control, could only sit still, powerless against the sheer honesty of her performance. The millionaire's posture began to change. He had challenged her expecting amusement, maybe a small display of talent he could patronize. But now he was leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on her in disbelief. He had seen many things in his life shows, performances, and presentations, but he had never seen someone command the room like this without even trying. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to control, impossible to compare to anything money could buy. A faint tremor ran through the audience. A woman near the piano wiped her eyes discreetly. A man near the back exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he hadn't realized he had been holding. The room had stopped being a gathering of people showing off status. It had become a living, breathing audience united by music. The young woman continued, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the music itself. She was telling a story of quiet strength, of perseverance, and of the beauty that comes from embracing one's true self. The song grew more complex, but she handled it effortlessly. Each note was precise, each transition smooth. It was clear she had spent countless hours practicing, honing not just her technique, but her understanding of the emotion behind each piece. The millionaire noticed the dedication, the discipline, the authenticity. He realized that no amount of money, no amount of privilege could substitute for this kind of talent and heart. He felt a strange humility rising in him, a recognition that some things in life were far beyond his control. As the music swelled, the room felt like it was holding its breath. People who had been skeptical, who had judged her quietly at first, were now fully absorbed. Their expressions reflected awe, their body language showed attentiveness, and even those who tried to remain composed could not hide the effect of her playing. It was not about competition or social rank. It was about the power of music to reach places that words could never touch. The young woman's hands moved faster now, yet never recklessly. Every keystroke was intentional, flowing seamlessly into the next. The story within the song was unfolding like a movie without words. Some guests felt chills run down their spines. Others found tears forming in their eyes despite themselves. No one had expected to feel so moved in a room filled with strangers, surrounded by luxury and elegance, yet here they were experiencing a raw, human moment that no one could deny. The millionaire's mind raced as he watched. He had thought this was a game, a moment of amusement. But now he realized it was a lesson in humility, in respect, and in the power of authenticity. His smirk was gone. His laughter had disappeared. All that remained was quiet observation and growing admiration. He had underestimated her, and the realization stung. Not because of pride alone, but because he understood now that he had been blind to what true talent and courage looked like. The young woman felt the intensity of the room, but she did not let it frighten her. Instead, she drew strength from it, channeling it into her playing. She remembered the countless nights of practice, the moments when no one believed in her, and the times when she had been told she was too small, too quiet, too ordinary. And yet here she was, transforming doubt into music, fear into melody, and judgment into admiration. Her song had become more than notes. It had become proof that perseverance and passion could break barriers that seemed impossible to cross. She allowed a single, high note to linger, almost floating in the air. It was delicate, haunting, and perfect. The sound seemed to reach every corner of the room, touching every listener in a deeply personal way. The silence that followed was unlike anything before. It wasn't expectant, it wasn't polite, it was reverent. Everyone understood, even subconsciously, that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The room itself seemed to pause, suspended in that final note. Holding on to the emotion that the music had released, the young woman's hands rested lightly on the keys for a moment, catching her breath, but the effect of her playing lingered like a gentle echo. The millionaire, standing at the edge of the performance, felt a lump in his throat he didn't expect. His usual sense of control had vanished. He had challenged her expecting to dominate the moment, but instead, he had been confronted with something far greater than his expectations, something genuine, uncalculated, and powerful. Even the most composed guests were affected. Some blinked quickly to hide their emotions. Others exhaled slowly, overwhelmed by the beauty of the music. No one had prepared for this. No one had imagined that a young woman, quiet and overlooked, could hold a room in her hands with nothing but the music she loved. And yet, here she was, doing exactly that. The young woman opened her eyes slowly, scanning the room briefly, not to gauge their reactions, but to remind herself of the impact of staying true to her passion. She had stepped into an unfamiliar world and made it hers, not by force but by authenticity. Every person in the room, from the wealthy guest to the millionaire himself, had been touched by something they hadn't anticipated. And she knew, in her heart, that this was only the beginning. The final note faded into the quiet hall, leaving a space that felt sacred, almost impossible to fill with anything mundane. The millionaire's gaze lingered on her, no longer challenging, no longer testing. For the first time that evening he was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he had been reminded of a truth that money, status, and power could never buy: the beauty of genuine talent and the strength of someone brave enough to embrace it. The young woman had done more than play a song. She had shifted the room's energy, humbled the proud, and inspired admiration without uttering a single word. She had transformed a casual challenge into a profound experience. And she had done it simply by being herself, listening to the music, and letting her heart guide her hands. And as the guests slowly began to murmur, still captivated and thoughtful, the young woman knew that the real power of her music was not in applause or recognition, but in the way it had touched the hearts of those present. One song, played with honesty and courage, had changed the room completely, and everyone who had witnessed it would carry that memory with them long after the notes had faded. The young woman's fingers hovered briefly over the piano keys, taking a small, steadying breath before continuing. The room, which had already been transformed by the previous song, now felt different, more alive, more fragile, and yet charged with an energy that no one could ignore. Guests who had come expecting polite music and polite smiles were now completely absorbed, as if the very walls of the hall were listening too. Every eye was on her, but there was no judgment. No amusement, only anticipation and wonder. She began to play again, this time with more depth, letting the melody flow naturally, guided by emotion rather than precision alone. The first notes were gentle, almost like whispers, but they grew steadily, rising and falling with a rhythm that captured the room's attention. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by the undeniable power of the music. Even those who had initially doubted her, whose eyes had flashed skepticism, now sat completely still, Unable to look away, the millionaire, who had been observing quietly, felt his confidence fading with each passing measure. He had intended this to be a challenge, a moment of entertainment at her expense. Yet here he was, utterly captivated. His arms had fallen from their crossed position. He now rested one hand on his chin as if trying to understand what was happening. He had witnessed talent before, of course, but this was different. It was not just technical skill or showmanship. It was honesty, emotion, and courage woven into sound. It was music that came from the soul, not from ambition or training alone. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her. The story she played was no longer just about herself. It was about the room, the people, and the invisible threads that connected them all in that moment. Her hands moved with confidence, sometimes softly, sometimes with urgency, carrying the emotions of struggle, hope, and quiet triumph. Every note had weight, and the audience felt it in a way words could never describe. A woman near the front clasped her hands together, her eyes glistening with tears she tried to hide. A man in the back leaned slightly forward, caught between disbelief and awe, as if he had been reminded of feelings he had long forgotten. The energy in the room shifted completely. It was no longer a gathering of wealthy people, all concerned with appearances and status. It was a space where the heart mattered more than gold, where emotion mattered more than influence, where honesty mattered more than power. The millionaire's gaze never left her hands. He noticed the small movements, the way her wrists curved as her fingers touched the keys, the way she breathed in time with the rhythm. It was mesmerizing. For the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of humility. He had always been in control of the situations he entered. He had always set the rules, dictated the flow, and commanded attention. But here, in this elegant hall filled with wealth and expectation, he was powerless. The music had overtaken him, leaving him as just another listener, vulnerable to its effect. The young woman let her song swell, allowing the notes to fill every corner of the hall. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was presence. The melody seemed to touch each person individually, bringing forth memories, dreams, and emotions that had been buried or ignored. The wealthy guests, who had initially thought of themselves as untouchable, were now exposed not in shame, but in the quiet vulnerability that comes when art moves the soul. Her hands moved faster now, dancing over the keys with a skill that was both precise and fluid. Yet there was no hurry, no desperation. Every movement was intentional, deliberate, and full of meaning. The audience could feel it. They could see the story unfold through her music, feel the highs and lows, the tensions and resolutions, the tiny victories hidden within each phrase. Some guests held their breath, afraid to interrupt the fragile beauty that had settled over the room. Others simply sat in awe, letting the music wash over them like a tide they had no control over. The millionaire felt a subtle shift in himself. He had entered the room expecting to dominate, expecting to test her, expecting to see a moment of failure or insecurity. But now he was experiencing the opposite. He was witnessing mastery, humility, and courage all at once. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that wealth and power could not create this kind of moment. This kind of effect, this kind of truth, came from something far more valuable. Authenticity. The young woman allowed a gentle pause in the music, letting a single note hang in the air. It was like a breath, a pause for reflection. The room felt it. Everyone sensed the silence, not as emptiness, but as a continuation of the story she was telling. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as skepticism had transformed into awe. What had been casual observation had become attentive reverence. And the millionaire, standing at the edge of his expectations, realized he had been humbled in a way that no amount of money or status could achieve. Her song began again, this time with more complexity. The melody intertwined high and low notes, building layers of emotion that seemed to reach into every heart present. Guests found themselves leaning in closer, captivated. Some could not believe what they were hearing. Others had tears they could no longer hold back. The music spoke of persistence, of silent struggle, and of the quiet courage that allows someone to rise above doubt. It spoke of life in a way that no conversation or display of wealth ever could. The millionaire's arms fell to his sides completely. He was no longer a figure of authority in the room. He was simply a listener like everyone else, caught in the power of someone else's gift. He realized that the young woman had done something remarkable. She had shifted the balance of attention, stripped away pretense, and reminded everyone present that true talent does not announce itself, it reveals itself quietly. Powerfully and without demand, the young woman continued to play, her eyes still closed, completely absorbed. The hall felt suspended in time. The air was thick with emotion, thick with admiration, and thick with something that couldn't be explained, an understanding that this performance was more than music. It was courage. It was truth. It was a reminder that even in a world that prized wealth, power, and image, there was room for something deeper, something raw, and something genuine. A soft gasp came from somewhere near the back. It was quickly stifled, but the reaction was undeniable. People were moved. They were unsettled in the best way. They were experiencing something that reached past decorum and sophistication, something that touched them in ways they had not expected. Some of the wealthiest guests in the room, accustomed to commanding attention and measuring success, were now quietly, profoundly affected by the sincerity and skill of someone they had initially underestimated. The young woman's song built to a gentle climax. Each note carried weight, each pause meaning. The room, once filled with casual conversation and polite smiles, was now utterly still. People had forgotten themselves, forgotten their status, and forgotten the careful manners that had guided their behavior just moments before. The music had taken over, and everyone present could feel it. The millionaire, who had started the evening as the instigator of the challenge, now felt a quiet admiration that surprised him. He realized that this young woman, unnoticed and underestimated, had revealed something fundamental, that courage and authenticity could hold a room in a way that power never could. He had been challenged not just by her presence, but by her ability to connect, inspire, and command attention through truth alone. She allowed one final chord to linger, soft but resolute, like a declaration without words. The effect was immediate. The room exhaled collectively, a gentle release after an emotional journey. Eyes opened, faces softened, and there was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just happened. The millionaire stood a little straighter, a little quieter, his respect for her evident in every subtle gesture. The young woman lifted her hands from the piano, feeling a wave of calm wash over her. She had faced skepticism, fear, and expectation, and she had transformed it all into music. The room had changed. The millionaire had changed, and even the guests, who had come for elegance and entertainment, were now witnesses to a moment that felt timeless. For the first time that evening, the audience realized that this performance had not been about the piano alone. It had been about courage, authenticity, and the quiet strength that comes from following one's passion despite doubt. And everyone present, whether wealthy or humble, confident or shy, had been touched by it. The young woman looked around briefly, acknowledging the room with a small, humble nod. There was no arrogance, no demand for applause, just a quiet pride in what she had shared. She had done what she had set out to do. She had let the music speak, and it had spoken louder than any words, louder than any social expectation, and louder than any challenge. And in that moment, the room, once filled with casual judgment and polite conversation, had been transformed into a space of shared humanity. One song, played with sincerity and courage, had shifted the energy, humbled the proud, and reminded everyone present that the most powerful things in life often come from the quietest, most unexpected sources. The young woman slowly lifted her hands from the piano keys, letting the final note resonate and fade into the quiet air. For a moment, the room remained completely still, not awkwardly, not because anyone was unsure what to do, but because every single person present was holding their breath, still caught in the spell she had cast. The wealthy guests, the ones who had arrived with a sense of entitlement and expectation, now looked genuinely, quietly awed. They had come expecting polite entertainment, perhaps a few polite smiles and a touch of refinement, but instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful, the millionaire, who had challenged her just minutes before with the confidence of someone used to control, now stood silently, his arms relaxed at his sides. His usual smug expression had disappeared, replaced by something he had rarely experienced, genuine admiration. He understood that what he had just witnessed could not be bought or manipulated. It wasn't a performance for show, it was honesty, courage, and talent combined into a single, unforgettable moment. Slowly, almost hesitantly at first, a small ripple of applause began. It was quiet, respectful, and sincere, not the polite clapping that often filled such rooms. One hand clapped, then another, until more and more guests joined. The sound grew steadily, filling the hall like a wave of recognition. The applause wasn't just for skill. It was for the courage it had taken to step into the room, to accept a challenge, and to pour her heart into the music without fear. The young woman felt a gentle warmth in her chest as she acknowledged the applause with a modest nod. She had never sought recognition, never craved the spotlight. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her music had reached people, had moved them, and had made them pause in a way that wealth and status never could. The applause reminded her that sometimes the simplest acts, just being authentic, just following your passion, could have the greatest impact. The millionaire stepped forward, his usual confidence tempered by respect. He raised his hand slightly, not in challenge this time, but in acknowledgement. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I've never seen anything like it." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. It was a recognition he rarely gave, a sincere admission that he had been wrong to underestimate her. Guests turned to him, noting his unusual humility, and then looked back at her. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as a casual challenge now became a moment of shared human experience. It was clear to everyone present that talent, courage, and authenticity held more power than money, influence, or expectation. The young woman had reminded them of something they often forgot, that true brilliance could appear where least expected, and that it demanded attention simply by existing. As the applause continued, the young woman allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She didn't need grand gestures or extravagant praise. The reaction of the room, the way the music had spoken for her, was enough. She remembered all the nights she had practiced alone, the times she had doubted herself, and the moments when no one believed in her. And now, in this elegant hall full of people who had assumed they knew everything about talent and success, she had proven that passion and authenticity could not be measured by appearances. The millionaire, still standing near the piano, gestured toward her. "I challenge anyone here to match what you just did," he said, a faint smile breaking his usual stern demeanor. "I don't think it's possible. You've shown all of us that true talent isn't something you can buy. It isn't something you can control, and it isn't something that follows the rules of this world. You've shown us something far greater." The words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. Guests nodded, murmuring in agreement, and some even glanced at one another with surprise. They had all come expecting a night of polite entertainment, yet here they were, humbled by a young woman they had barely noticed just minutes before. The realization slowly sank in. Status, wealth, and influence could not replace heart, skill, and authenticity. Some of the guests approached her quietly, offering compliments that felt heartfelt, not forced. "That was beautiful," one whispered, unable to stop their voice from trembling slightly. Another added, "I've never experienced music like that before." Even the staff, who had been observing from the sidelines, looked genuinely moved. She had taken a simple piano, her quiet determination, and transformed the space into something extraordinary. The millionaire extended his hand toward her, not as a challenge, but as a gesture of respect. "You've changed the room tonight," he said, his voice softer now, filled with an emotion that was rare for him. "I underestimated you, and I was wrong. Thank you for reminding us all what true talent looks like." She accepted the gesture with humility, nodding slightly, grateful but not seeking approval. She understood that the impact of her performance wasn't in recognition or praise, it was in the way it had touched the hearts of those Present. Guests slowly began to clap again. This time louder, more enthusiastically, some even standing to show their admiration. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had been an event defined by wealth and status had become a shared human experience, a moment of connection and recognition. The young woman, who had entered quietly and almost unnoticed, had become the center of attention not through bravado, but through her honesty, her courage, and her dedication to her passion. She stepped back from the piano, her heart still racing but with a deep sense of fulfillment. The room was no longer about social standing or judgment. It was about people, about emotion, and about the unexpected power of authenticity. Even the millionaire, who had begun the evening confident and playful, now looked at her with genuine respect. He had been reminded that humility and admiration could sometimes come from the most unexpected sources. The young woman knew that this moment would stay with her forever, just as it would stay with the guests who had witnessed it. One song, played with sincerity and courage, had changed not just the room but the people within it. It had shown them the value of listening, of paying attention, and of recognizing the quiet strength in someone who had nothing to prove except to themselves. Some guests approached her directly, expressing their astonishment. "I've never heard anything like that in my life," one said softly. Another added, "You've reminded me why I love music." That was incredible. Even those who were usually reserved, who rarely showed emotion publicly, were visibly moved. She smiled politely, letting their words wash over her, knowing that their reactions were a testament not to her ego, but to the truth she had shared through her music. The millionaire finally spoke again, his tone calm but full of genuine feeling. "You've reminded all of us why we should never underestimate anyone," he said. "Talent, courage, and authenticity don't wear labels or follow rules. Tonight, you've shown us the power of being true to yourself. And that is far more impressive than anything money can buy." His words echoed through the room, quiet but weighty, and the guests nodded in agreement. Some visibly moved to the point of tears. The young woman took a small step back, letting the room breathe, letting the applause die down naturally. She didn't need to seek more attention. The effect of her music had already spoken louder than words ever could. Everyone in the room understood, even if subconsciously, that they had just witnessed something rare, something unforgettable. The energy had shifted, expectations had been broken, and admiration had been earned through honesty and skill alone. For a moment, she looked at the piano, the instrument that had carried her through so many private nights, through so many quiet struggles. It had been her companion, her teacher, and her outlet. Tonight it had become her voice, her way of connecting with a room full of strangers, and her way of proving to herself that her passion was worth sharing. No matter the odds, the millionaire extended his hand one final time, not as a challenge but as an acknowledgement. "Thank you for reminding us all of what truly matters," he said. "Tonight you've changed not just this room, but perhaps even how we see the world around us." She accepted the gesture, feeling a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't played for approval or fame. She had played because it was who she was, and in doing so, she had created something that could never be measured by money or influence. As the night wore on, guests lingered, talking softly about what they had experienced. The young woman stayed quietly in the background, no longer unnoticed, but no longer seeking attention. She had shown that even one person, with courage and authenticity, could change the energy of an entire room. People remembered the way the music had made them feel, the subtle notes, the pauses, the emotion that ran through every phrase. It was a lesson they would carry with them, that brilliance often comes quietly, and that respect is earned through truth, not status. By the time she left the hall, the applause had faded, but the impact remained. The millionaire, now smiling genuinely, watched her go with a newfound respect. He had challenged her, expecting to amuse himself, but instead, he had been reminded of something far more important: the power of authenticity, the beauty of courage, and the undeniable force of talent expressed with honesty. The young woman stepped into the night air, feeling the cool breeze on her face, She felt light, free, and proud, not because she had